I want you to imagine the cold pressing in from all sides, ice wind slicing through frozen air, snow piling on rooftops, every path swallowed by whiteness. In that moment, a woman named Ruth Lawson, decades older than most of us, sitting alone in her small home on the outskirts of town, hears a distant pounding at her door. Her heart flutters. She is no hero. She has no expectation. But what's outside? Men, dozens of them, cloaked in leather and frost, are closer to giving up than she ever could. Ruth doesn't pause for fear. She opens the door. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At the very edge of town, behind a leaning wooden fence half buried in snowdrifts, sat the home of Ruth Lawson. It was a cottage that had weathered countless winters, its paint faded from decades of storms and summers, its roof patched by the steady hands of a woman who had grown used to doing things on her own. Inside, the fire in her small stone hearth crackled softly, the only sound competing with the endless howl of the blizzard outside. Ruth sat in her worn armchair near the flames, a heavy knitted shawl draped over her shoulders, her silver hair pinned neatly as it always had been. Her hands, though marked by age, moved steadily with the rhythm of her knitting needles. This cottage had been her sanctuary since her husband passed years earlier, and with her children scattered across distant states, it was now both her comfort and her burden. Ruth Lawson sat in the glow of the fire, her eyes drifting away from the movement of her knitting needles to the empty chair across from her. That chair had once belonged to her husband, a man she had shared nearly 5 decades of life with before illness claimed him one quiet winter. She could still picture him sitting there, boots drying by the fire, his laughter filling the little cottage in a way that seemed to keep the storms outside at bay. Now, the chair stood as a silent reminder of what she had lost. Her children, grown and busy with lives of their own in faraway cities, called when they could, but the warmth of their voices on the phone was never quite enough to fill the emptiness of the long nights. Winters had always been harsh in that part of the country, but for Ruth, each passing season seemed colder, each storm a little lonelier, as if the snow itself was pressing her solitude deeper into the walls of her home. The storm outside Ruth Lawson's cottage grew louder, the wind rattling the shutters as though demanding to be let in. She set her knitting down on the small table beside her and leaned closer to the fire, drawing the warmth into her tired bones. The world beyond her door was swallowed in white, the roads impassable, the air so cold it could turn breath to frost in an instant. Ruth had seen enough winters to know what that kind of storm could do to someone caught without shelter. She closed her eyes, folded her weathered hands, and whispered softly into the quiet of her cottage. It was not a prayer for herself. She had learned long ago how to endure the loneliness of these nights. But for anyone out there struggling against the storm, a traveler stranded, a family cut off, or even a stranger she would never meet, all she asked was that they might find a roof, a fire, and enough warmth to see the morning sun. Ruth Lawson had barely finished whispering her prayer when the sound came, so sudden and sharp it nearly made her drop the shawl from her shoulders. A heavy knock, forceful enough to rattle the old wooden door on its hinges, echoed through the cottage. For a moment she sat frozen in her chair, her heart thudding against her chest. No one came calling at this hour, not in the middle of a blizzard, not when the roads were buried, and the world outside seemed abandoned to the snow. She wondered if perhaps she had imagined it, some trick of the storm slamming a loose shutter. But then it came again, louder this time, deliberate and urgent. Ruth rose slowly, pulling her shawl tight around her, her slippers shuffling across the creaking wooden floor. The thought of who, or what, might be on the other side of that door sent a shiver down her spine. With trembling hands, Ruth Lawson reached for the latch and pulled the heavy wooden door open against the force of the wind, the blizzard immediately rushing in with a bitter sting. What she saw standing on her doorstep made her gasp and cling tighter to her shawl. There, half-shadowed by the swirling snow, were 15 men, broad-shouldered and clad in heavy leather jackets, their patches marked with the name Iron Serpents, a motorcycle club that carried a reputation most small towns whispered about. Their beards were stiff with frost, their faces raw from the bitter cold, their boots buried ankle-deep in the drift. Behind them, a row of motorcycles leaned together, their chrome dulled and nearly swallowed by the snow that had fallen through the night. These were men that many would have turned away in fear, but as Ruth looked closer, she didn't see menace. She saw lips turned blue, hands shaking violently, and eyes filled with exhaustion. The unmistakable look of human beings fighting simply to survive the storm. Ruth Lawson stood framed in the doorway, the storm swirling around her as she looked upon the 15 men who called themselves the Iron Serpents. For years, their name had carried a weight in nearby towns, rumors of roaring engines, late-night gatherings, and a roughness that made most decent folk cross the street rather than meet their eyes. Ruth had heard the talk too, though it rarely concerned her. She had lived long enough to know that whispers often grew larger than the truth. Yet here they were, not as fierce outlaws of local legend, but as men stripped down by the merciless hand of winter. Their leather jackets, once a symbol of power and identity, were now stiff with ice. Their lips quivered blue with cold, their hands shook uncontrollably, and their eyes pleaded without words. For the first time in years, Ruth did not see what others had warned her about. She saw the raw humanity of men who, despite their fearsome reputation, were vulnerable in the face of nature's unforgiving storm. For a moment the world seemed to pause, the howling wind pressing against the walls of the cottage as Ruth Lawson stood in silence, her frail frame dwarfed by the towering figures before her. They looked at her as though uncertain of what to expect. Would this elderly woman slam the door as so many others might, or would she risk everything to let them in? Ruth's heart pounded in her chest, but compassion had always outweighed fear in her life. She tightened the shawl around her shoulders, drew a steadying breath, and in a voice both soft and commanding she whispered, "Come in before you freeze." The men hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances, their breath rising in frosty clouds. They had likely been turned away from more doors than they could count, judged long before anyone bothered to hear their voices. Yet here, in the dead of night, a woman they had never met was offering them shelter. Slowly, one stepped forward, then another, until the entire group began to shuffle into the warmth of Ruth's cottage, their boots leaving trails of snow across her worn wooden floor. As Ruth Lawson stepped aside, the men of the Iron Serpents filed cautiously into the little cottage, each carrying with him the storm that clung to his coat and boots. The warmth of the fire greeted them immediately, though it did little at first to thaw the chill that had settled deep into their bones. One by one they entered until the small living room, once quiet and spacious enough for Ruth alone, felt crowded and alive with the heavy presence of leather jackets, snow-dusted boots, and the sharp metallic scent of engines still cooling outside. Their breath rose in visible clouds as they stood awkwardly, unsure of where to place themselves in a room that seemed far too delicate for men who had spent most of their lives on the open road. Ruth closed the door behind them, shutting out the roar of the blizzard, and for the first time that night, her cottage felt more like a sanctuary than a lonely refuge. Ruth Lawson, though small in stature compared to the towering men now filling her home, moved with a quiet authority born of years spent caring for others. Without hesitation, she slipped into the narrow kitchen, her slippers shuffling across the linoleum floor, and began pulling down what little she had stored away. A loaf of bread, slightly stale but still good, was placed on the counter. A few cans of soup, kept for emergencies, were set beside it. At the very back of her refrigerator, she found a pot of leftover stew she had planned to make last her through the storm. She did not think twice about giving it away. Soon the cottage filled with the smell of something warm and nourishing as she stirred the stew on the stove and ladled soup into mismatched bowls she had collected over a lifetime. When she carried the first tray into the living room, the men looked at her in stunned silence, as if uncertain whether they deserved such kindness. But Ruth offered the bread and steaming bowls with the same gentle smile she would have given her own children, and in that moment the food became more than a meal. It became a gesture of dignity, a reminder that even strangers in need were worthy of warmth and care. With bowls of soup balanced carefully in their hands and plates of bread resting on their knees, the men of the Iron Serpents sat scattered around Ruth Lawson's tiny living room, looking oddly out of place against the floral-patterned couches and creaking wooden chairs that had furnished her home for decades. The room, once a quiet haven of solitude, was now filled with leather jackets, tattooed arms, and the heavy scent of melted snow dripping from their boots onto her rug. They shifted uncomfortably, their broad frames hunched forward, as though afraid of breaking the delicate furniture. For men who spent their lives commanding the open road, who were used to suspicion and sideways glances, this moment was strangely disarming. None of them knew how to act in the presence of a frail elderly woman who treated them not as outlaws, not as a burden, but as guests. Ruth moved gently among them, adjusting a cup here, offering more bread there. Her presence soft but steady, while the men exchanged quiet glances, struggling to reconcile the warmth of her hospitality with the cold reputation that usually followed them wherever they went. As the warmth of Ruth Lawson's cottage slowly eased the chill from their bones, the men of the Iron Serpents began to share in halting words the tale of how they had come to be stranded on her doorstep. One of the older bikers, his beard heavy with frost now dripping onto his jacket, explained that they had been riding back from a gathering across state lines when the storm began to build faster than anyone expected. Highways were shut down behind them as snowplows failed to keep up, and the exits that led to small towns offered no relief. Motels filled within hours, restaurants shuttered, and gas stations locked tight against the storm. They had tried to push through, but as the wind whipped harder and the snow blinded their path, their bikes grew harder to control. Stopping became their only option. With nowhere else to go and the cold seeping deeper into their skin, they had stumbled toward the dim glow of Ruth's cottage light, desperate for even a moment's reprieve. Their voices carried no bravado as they spoke, only exhaustion and a quiet gratitude that they had been seen, that someone had answered their desperate knock. The storm continued to batter the world outside, but inside Ruth Lawson's cottage, a different kind of stillness began to take root. The men of the Iron Serpents, once stiff and uncertain, now leaned toward the crackling fire as its orange glow wrapped around them like a long-forgotten comfort. Ruth, ever attentive, had brewed a large pot of coffee, its aroma filling the small home with a richness that cut through the lingering scent of damp leather and melted snow. She handed each man a chipped mug, and as they cupped their rough hands around the warmth, their shoulders seemed to ease for the first time that night. Steam curled upward from their jackets as they draped them over chairs near the hearth, the leather softening again under the heat. One of the younger bikers, his face weathered but not yet hardened by age, closed his eyes and exhaled deeply, as though the fire itself was restoring something more than just body heat. In the glow of those flames, the sharp edges of their reputations dulled, replaced instead by softened expressions, quiet murmurs of thanks, and the unspoken realization that, in this unlikely place, they had found a moment of peace. As the night pressed on and the blizzard showed no sign of easing, Ruth Lawson quietly slipped away from the fire and into the back room of her cottage. From a cedar chest that had held the memories of decades past, she pulled out a stack of handmade quilts, each stitched in her younger years with careful fingers and each carrying the faint scent of lavender from sachets she kept tucked between the folds. Returning to the living room, she draped them gently over the broad shoulders of the Iron Serpents, men who looked almost childlike now in their exhaustion. Some mumbled a soft, "Thank you," while others, too weary to form words, only nodded with heavy eyelids. One by one, their heads sank back against the floral cushions, the wooden chairs, even the braided rug on the floor, as they surrendered to the warmth of the cottage. Soon the room was filled with the steady rhythm of deep breathing and the occasional thunderous snore, a sound so foreign to Ruth's quiet nights yet strangely comforting in its own way. For the first time in many winters, her little home was alive with company, and as she watched these unlikely guests drift into sleep beneath her quilts, Ruth felt the ache of loneliness lift, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. Ruth Lawson stood in the doorway of her small living room, the glow of the fire casting soft light across the faces of the 15 men now resting soundly under her quilts. Their breathing rose and fell in uneven harmony, a chorus of strangers who only hours ago had been fighting for their lives against the storm. She studied them quietly. And in their slumber, she did not see the hardened reputation of the Iron Serpents, nor the rough exteriors that might have once made her wary. Instead, she saw the vulnerability of sons who had found unexpected safety beneath her roof. A warmth spread through her chest, one that had little to do with the fire, and everything to do with the stirrings of something she hadn't felt in years. For so long, Ruth's cottage had been a place of silence, her days marked by solitude, her nights echoing with absence. But in that moment, watching over these men as though they were her own, she felt the unmistakable pull of a mother's heart. Her loneliness, once as heavy as the snow piling outside, seemed to melt away, replaced by a profound sense of connection and belonging. As night gave way to morning, the storm that had raged so violently over the little town finally loosened its grip. The wind stilled, and a quiet, unlike any other, settled over Ruth Lawson's cottage. When she pulled back the curtain of her frosted window, she was met with a breathtaking sight. The world blanketed in white so pure and untouched it glistened like a field of diamonds under the first rays of dawn. The snow draped over rooftops, bent tree branches low, and sparkled across the frozen ground in a brilliance that only followed the fiercest storms. Inside, the fire had dwindled to glowing embers, but its warmth still lingered. Ruth turned to see her guests slowly stirring, rubbing their eyes, stretching their arms, and blinking against the soft light that poured through the small windows. Leather jackets rustled, boots scuffed against the floorboards, and weary faces, now refreshed by rest, began to rise. What had entered her home the night before as desperate strangers were waking in the morning as something different, a group of men bound together not just by their brotherhood, but now by the kindness of an old woman who had offered them shelter in their darkest hour. Ruth Lawson moved with a steadiness that morning that belied her years, her hands busy in the kitchen as she cracked eggs into a pan and whisked them with care. The sizzle of butter meeting the skillet filled the air, soon joined by the warm, comforting scent of scrambled eggs cooking. She set slices of bread into the old toaster, watching them brown before spreading them with butter that softened instantly against the heat. The coffee pot bubbled once more, filling the cottage with its rich aroma, promising comfort in each steaming cup. When she carried the platters into the living room, the men of the Iron Serpents sat waiting, their broad frames crowding the delicate furniture, their eyes heavy but softened with gratitude. They accepted their plates in silence at first, eating quietly, the only sounds the scrape of forks and the crackle of the fire's embers. Yet their silence was not empty. It was full of respect, a wordless recognition of a woman who had given them more than food and warmth. Ruth caught their glances, the way their eyes softened as they met hers, and she knew their gratitude ran deeper than words could reach. As the men finished their breakfast, the cottage fell into a quiet stillness, the kind that carried weight far beyond the simple clatter of dishes. Ruth Lawson gathered the empty plates with her usual calm, but before she could retreat to the kitchen, one of the men rose slowly to his feet. He was taller than the rest, his frame broad, his shoulders carrying the unmistakable air of authority. His steel-gray eyes, sharp yet softened by sincerity, settled on Ruth with a steady gaze. This was Victor Kane, the leader of the Iron Serpents, a man whose very presence commanded respect among his brothers. For a moment he seemed to struggle with words, the kind of man more comfortable with action than sentiment, but he cleared his throat and spoke with a quiet resolve. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low yet firm, "we'll never forget this." The other men nodded in agreement, their eyes fixed on Ruth as though she were more than just the woman who had offered them shelter. She had become a figure etched into their brotherhood's memory. Ruth gave a small smile, humbled by the gravity of his words, and in her heart, she knew that what had happened within her walls that night was something none of them would ever truly leave behind. When breakfast was finished and the last mugs of coffee had been drained, the men of the Iron Serpents began to gather their things. They pulled on their jackets, now dry and softened from the fire, and laced up boots that had once been stiff with ice, but were now ready for the road ahead. Ruth Lawson stood at the doorway as they filed out one by one, her shawl pulled close around her shoulders to guard against the lingering bite of morning air. Outside, The snow still lay heavy, but the skies had cleared, and a pale winter sun shone across the hills, turning the icy drifts into a landscape of glittering white. The men wheeled their motorcycles upright, brushing snow from the chrome and leather, their engines coughing to life with a low growl that quickly swelled into a roar. The sound rattled through the quiet town, fierce yet steady, a reminder of who they were. One by one, they gave Ruth a nod, a word of thanks, or simply a glance that spoke volumes. And then, in a single line, they rode off into the snowy hills, their figures fading into the distance until the rumble of engines disappeared altogether. Ruth remained at her doorway, watching the trail they left behind, the silence of her cottage returning at last. She was alone again, yet not quite the same, for her heart carried the memory of the night when 15 strangers had filled her home with life. Ruth Lawson closed the door gently behind her and returned to the stillness of her cottage. The fire had burned low, the quilts lay folded neatly again, and the faint scent of coffee still lingered in the air. For a moment, it felt as though the night before had been nothing more than a dream. 15 weary men finding refuge beneath her roof, their gratitude warming her more than the fire ever could. She told herself it was a one-night miracle, a fleeting intersection of lives that would fade as quickly as the storm itself. Yet in her heart, Ruth knew that kindness does not vanish once given. It leaves an imprint, an echo that lingers far beyond the moment. Though the men had ridden away into the snowy hills, the memory of her open door and warm hearth traveled with them, carried on the roar of their engines and the bonds they shared. What Ruth did not yet realize was that acts of compassion have a way of returning, multiplied and magnified in ways one can never predict. The following morning, as Ruth Lawson moved about her quiet cottage, tidying the remnants of the night before, a sound reached her ears that made her pause. At first, it was faint, a low rumble that she mistook for distant thunder rolling over the hills. But the sky outside was clear, the storm long gone, and the sun gleamed against the frozen drifts of snow. She set down the dish she was drying and listened more closely. The sound grew louder, steadier, and soon the very ground beneath her small home seemed to tremble. It was a vibration that rattled the windows in their frames and sent a shiver up her spine. Ruth's heart quickened as she walked slowly toward the door, her shawl trailing behind her. She had lived long enough to recognize the sound of engines when they came together in force, and this was no single motorcycle. This was dozens, no, perhaps more, approaching down the long, snow-packed road that led straight to her cottage. Ruth Lawson pulled open her door and stepped onto the porch, the cold air nipping at her cheeks, her breath curling into the morning light. At first, all she could see was the empty stretch of snow-covered road winding down the hill, but soon the horizon began to move. A line of dark figures emerged against the white expanse, growing larger with every passing second. Then the sound hit her fully, the synchronized thunder of engines, not 10, not 20, but a vast wave of machines rolling forward as one. Chrome glinted in the sunlight, tires chewed through the packed snow, and the ground shook as if the earth itself recognized their arrival. 100 motorcycles, their riders leather-clad and resolute, advanced together in a formation so powerful it stole the breath from Ruth's lungs. She clutched her shawl tight around her shoulders, her eyes wide with disbelief. Never in all her years had she witnessed such a sight. A sea of bikes stretching across the road, every single one of them heading straight toward her little cottage, as though it were the most important destination in the world. As the roar of engines rolled through the quiet town, it was impossible for anyone to ignore. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted, and one by one, windows flew open, as neighbors leaned out to see the spectacle unfolding before their eyes. They watched in disbelief as a flood of motorcycles poured down the road, chrome flashing, exhausts rumbling like a storm reborn. 100 bikers in full leather rode with precision, their sheer presence swallowing the sleepy street in a way that made the air feel heavy with power. Mothers pulled their children closer from porches, shopkeepers paused mid-sweep of their stoops, and older residents shook their heads in unease, whispering the name Iron Serpents with tones laced in both awe and fear. For years, stories about this club had traveled through the town in half-truths and rumors, warnings traded in hushed voices. Yet none had ever seen such a gathering. And there, at the end of the road, at the edge of town, the line of engines slowed, their thunderous presence settling like a wave against the doorstep of Ruth Lawson's little cottage. As the 100 motorcycles came to a halt, the rumbling faded into a low purr that seemed to vibrate through the snow-covered street. Ruth Lawson stood frozen on her porch, clutching her shawl tight around her frail shoulders, unsure what to expect. Then, from the very front of the formation, a single rider dismounted. It was Victor Kane, tall and imposing, the unmistakable leader of the Iron Serpents. But as he walked toward Ruth, there was no menace in his stride, only a steady calm. His steel-gray eyes, which had seemed so fierce the morning before, now carried something different: respect, gratitude, even a hint of reverence. When he reached her porch, he extended his hand, and in it rested a bouquet of fresh flowers, vibrant and fragrant, their petals soft against the bitter chill of winter. Ruth's eyes widened, for she knew such blossoms could not have been plucked from the frozen ground outside. They had been sought out, carried across miles, and brought to her as a token of honor. "Ma'am," Victor said, his voice deep but gentle, "this is for you." Ruth's hand trembled as she accepted the flowers, tears welling in her eyes. The sight of this hardened man offering her something so delicate and rare in the dead of winter was almost too much for her heart to bear. Ruth Lawson could hardly believe her eyes as Victor Kane stepped aside and raised a gloved hand. At his signal, the Iron Serpents dismounted one by one, their boots crunching in the snow as they began unloading the treasures strapped to their bikes. From saddlebags and trailers came bundles of groceries: flour, sugar, dried beans, and jars of preserves carefully wrapped against the cold. Others carried heavy boxes filled with warm clothes, sturdy boots, and thick coats, the kind that would last Ruth through many winters to come. A group of the younger men hauled stacks of freshly cut firewood, their arms straining as they piled it neatly by her porch, ensuring that her hearth would never go cold again. Another set of bikers rolled forward small crates packed with candles, soap, medical supplies, and every necessity she could possibly imagine. Ruth's breath caught in her throat as she realized this wasn't a simple visit. It was an outpouring of gratitude. The men she had once welcomed into her humble cottage during a storm had returned, not just with thanks, but with provisions that spoke louder than words. Her cottage, once so quiet and sparse, was suddenly surrounded by life, by abundance, by the unspoken promise that she would never be left to struggle alone again. And all the while, Victor Kane stood nearby, watching her reaction with the faintest smile, as though he understood exactly what this moment meant for her. What followed was a sight Ruth Lawson would never have believed had she not witnessed it with her own eyes. The once quiet yard around her little cottage soon bustled with the sound of hammers, shovels, and cheerful voices. The Iron Serpents, men whose reputations had long been whispered about in town as fierce, untouchable, even dangerous, were now spread across her property, working with the diligence of neighbors and the spirit of kin. Two of them set about repairing her sagging fence, driving in new posts and straightening boards that had leaned for years. Another group shoveled her long, snow-packed driveway until the ground was clean and clear, the men laughing as they tossed snow over their shoulders in playful competition. On the porch, a pair knelt at her door, tightening the old hinge that had squeaked for decades, oiling it until it swung smooth and silent. Others patched the loose boards on her steps, while still more stacked the firewood higher, building walls of warmth for the long winter ahead. For hours, the air around Ruth's home rang with the hum of activity, deep voices calling for tools, bursts of laughter echoing across the yard, the rhythmic pound of nails meeting wood. It was as though her cottage, once quiet and solitary, had been reborn with life. Standing on her porch with the bouquet of winter flowers still clutched in her hands, Ruth Lawson could not stop the tears that blurred her vision. These men, once strangers, now filled her home with a joy and energy it had not known in years. The Iron Serpents worked not out of obligation, but out of genuine gratitude, And in their laughter, Ruth heard the sound of family where she had once thought herself alone. As Ruth Lawson stood at the edge of her porch watching the Iron Serpents repair, rebuild and laugh as though they had known her all their lives, a revelation welled up inside her heart. Only a few nights ago, she had opened her door in the middle of a storm to 15 weary riders, cold, hungry, and uncertain where to turn. She had given them little more than what she had: warmth from her fire, quilts from her closet, food from her pantry, and kindness from her spirit. To her, it had been a simple decision, born not of wealth or abundance, but of compassion. Yet now, standing amidst the rumble of engines, the sound of shovels biting into ice, and the echo of hearty laughter, Ruth understood that no act of kindness is ever truly small. Her gesture had rippled outward, reaching into the hearts of men who carried it far beyond that night. And now, here they were, 100 strong, returning to her not just with gratitude, but with abundance, transforming her cottage and her life in ways she could never have. By the time the sun hung high above the snowy hills, Ruth Lawson's little cottage had been transformed, not just in appearance, but in spirit. The fence stood straight and proud, her driveway clear, her porch sturdy and sound. Groceries filled her shelves. Wood was stacked high and her cupboards brimmed with more than she had seen in years. Yet it wasn't the supplies or repairs that made her heart swell. It was the presence of the Iron Serpents themselves. These men, once feared across the countryside for their leather jackets, roaring engines, and the fierce reputation that clung to their name, no longer seemed like outlaws or outsiders. To Ruth, they felt like kin. They lounged around her yard now, laughing over shared stories, their breath turning to mist in the winter air, their hands no longer burdened with weapons but with tools, food, and warmth. Some of them played with the neighbors' children who had crept closer out of curiosity, while others teased one another as brothers do. And at the center of it all stood Victor Kane, tall and steady, watching Ruth with the quiet pride of a man who understood that something greater than reputation bound them together now. For Ruth Lawson, it was as though a new family had been written into her life, not by bloodlines or tradition, but by kindness freely given and loyalty earned in return. She had welcomed 15 strangers in a storm, and now she stood surrounded by 100 men who would forever carry her in their hearts as one of their own. In that moment, Ruth knew she was no longer simply a widow in a lonely cottage. She was family to the Iron Serpents, and they were family to her. As the golden light of evening stretched across the snow-dusted hills, the Iron Serpents gathered once more at the edge of Ruth Lawson's cottage. The day had been filled with work, laughter, and the steady hum of fellowship. But now the time had come for them to return to the long roads that awaited. One by one they mounted their bikes, the chrome catching the last rays of sunlight like fire. Ruth stood at her porch, clutching the bouquet of winter flowers Victor Kane had given her, her eyes glistening with both joy and sorrow at their impending departure. Victor, tall and steady, turned toward her with a respectful nod that spoke volumes. No words needed, for both knew what had been built between them could not be broken by distance. Then, at his signal, every rider twisted the throttle. The engines roared to life in perfect unison, not the chaotic thunder of intimidation the townsfolk had always feared, but a symphony of strength and gratitude. The ground trembled beneath Ruth's feet, her heart pounding as the sound rose and swelled into the cold evening air. It was not noise, it was a salute. A thunderous tribute offered to the woman whose simple act of compassion had bound them all together. The neighbors, still peeking from windows and porches, watched in awe, their unease melting into silence as they realized what this moment meant. And Ruth Lawson, her frail frame silhouetted against the glow of her cottage, felt the vibrations course through her very soul. The Iron Serpents had come as strangers, but as their engines roared for her, she knew they were leaving as family, forever carrying her name, her kindness, and her spirit down every road they traveled. As the last echo of engines faded into the twilight, Ruth Lawson stood on her porch, one hand clutching the bouquet of flowers, the other lifted in a trembling wave. Her eyes shimmered with tears, not of sadness, but of joy so deep it seemed to spill from her very soul. She knew now that her cottage, once marked by silence and solitude, would never feel empty again. For in a single act of kindness, opening her door to 15 weary bikers on a stormy night, she had gained a family that stretched far beyond bloodlines, a family that rode on 2 wheels and carried her memory wherever the road might take them. The snow sparkled like diamonds around her, and Ruth whispered softly to herself, "Never alone again." The Iron Serpents had given her more than repairs, more than gifts. They had given her belonging, purpose, and the knowledge that her heart's compassion had sparked something eternal. If you were in Ruth Lawson's place, would you have opened your door to 15 strangers in the middle of a storm? If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales of humanity and hope.